What would that imply for the stability of our civilization? Well, it would imply, I think, that our entire civilization would collapse completely. So I wanted to know more about that. And that's when I discovered that science had no answer.
Who owns the story owns the truth. And as Randall Carlson warns, the gatekeepers of history are the architects of our ignorance.
For me, it just comes down to looking at all sides of, I try to look at different perspectives. So I might read, Paul Johnson to get more like the conservative interpretive of history. And I might read somebody else to get a more liberal, left-wing side. Then, you look at, to me, it's a matter of looking at all sides, applying your reason, your critical thinking abilities, and in knowing, for example, how propaganda works, learning how to recognize it, because now propaganda is everywhere, it's prevalent. And it's all pretty much leading us to the mindset of accepting this authoritarian hierarchical structure of society. And, trust the experts when it comes to foreign policy, trust the experts. When it comes to climate change, trust the experts. And if you're not, a government-funded scientist, your opinion on climate change doesn't amount to anything.
Critical thinking is the sacred tool of the seeker. Question every narrative, interrogate every source, and illuminate the darkness they wish to keep us in.
So for me, it's just a matter of critical thinking, using your reason, being skeptical, looking at all sides of an issue, and I think that we can sort it out. I've looked at the climate. I got interested in climate change, literally back in the 70s, and so I started studying it. And when about 1992, when the IPCC published its first report, I thought good, because by that time I had learned enough to realize that in the past, there had been extreme climate changes on planet Earth, and we didn't have an explanation for that. Where I grew up in Minnesota was right at the edge of one of the great ice sheets that existed down till about 10,000 years ago.
Cosmic impacts, Randall reveals, are the silent heralds of destruction, shaping the Earth and rewriting the destiny of civilizations without warning.
I think that a couple of things we could comment there. I think that, yes, I think clearly what the record shows, the geological, paleontological, archaeological record shows, is that there are these repeated interruptions within the continuum of change. And in my mind, the most likely trigger for these interruptions is cosmic impact. But it's also, I use the term exogenic, which means from outside. So the primary trigger for these is exogenic in origin. But I think there's also can be a very powerful endogenic response. So that we mentioned this in our first conversation, that impacts, may also trigger extended episodes of volcanism. They may be responsible for, and this goes back to the work of Fred Hoyle and Chandra Wickramasinghe, who theorized really even back in the 70s and 80s that it might have been impact-type events responsible for bringing for the onset of an ice age and the global cooling. And then that idea was picked up by Klube, Napier, Asher, and those guys of the British neo-catastrophist school, who came to believe that, they used the term cosmic winter. And it was interesting that back in the early 80s, you of course have heard the term nuclear winter. That was when it was realized by scientists that there would be very crossover type of similarities between an all-out and a cosmic impact. However, we know from Tunguska that, the ozone layer can be dramatically depleted in an impact, which would then allow more cosmic radiation to reach the surface of the Earth. It's usually being buffered by the ozone. So there could be that whole level of consequences also to a cosmic impact event. But there's the similarities, the fire, the dust injected into the atmosphere that increases the opacity of the atmosphere and the reflectivity of it, so that thermal energy coming in from the sun is reflected back to space, causing a cooling on the surface.
The rapid shifts in climate that punctuate human history are not accidents. They are the echoes of celestial chaos, steering humanity into the unknown.
and that this could lead to might be what's triggering some of these rapid climate changes. And now, with the advent of the Younger Dryas, it really does look like we can see the onset of a cosmic winter coinciding precisely within, which I believe to be a series of impacts. I don't think we can explain the Younger Dryas events by a single impact. But we know now that those things are feasible. We witnessed it for ourselves in 1994 with the multiple 21 impacts on the Jovian surface within 1 year. I mean, within 1 week of July 1994. And I think that was another important cosmic lesson. I kind of looked that there's a number of these things that have taught us things that are really critical for us to understand the nature of this larger environment in which we find ourselves. And we have to start thinking in those terms, that we are part of a cosmic ecosystem. For measurements of annual ice layer thickness over the past 15,000 years, the authors find that Greenland's climate, emerging from the last ice age, twice shifted from glacial to interglacial conditions over an astonishingly quick 3 to 5 years. Now, can you imagine glacial to interglacial? Can you imagine that our world shifting from interglacial conditions now into full glacial mode within 3 to 5 years? What would that imply for the stability of our civilization? Well, it would imply, I think, that our entire civilization would collapse completely, because there's so many ramifications to what that means. And of course, if we shifted into a full glacial mode now, we're going to experience the same kind of agricultural collapses that we saw on a lesser scale during the Little Ice Age and the Dark Ages, right?
Imagine a world where agriculture collapses overnight. A chilling possibility when nature's fury outpaces humanity's ability to adapt. Randall sees the fragility of our existence.
I think we would see a global collapse of agriculture. We would see extreme cold that people wouldn't have been able to adapt. It would spell clearly the end of our civilization. You'll see that graph that's the late Pleistocene megamammals that inhabited the Earth that are now gone. And I'll mention something briefly about them. We've lost roughly half of the species of animals over 100 pounds in body weight. Anything over 100 pounds in body weight, or about 44 kilos, is considered a megamammal. So we're in a room here full of megamammals. So if it's a new way for you to think about yourself, unless you weigh less than 100 pounds, then you are not in the megamammal club anymore. So what you see here is that each square here represents the finding of a fossil of an extinct megamammal. And of course, what you see here is that at the end, it just spikes dramatically around the Younger Dryas. Okay, so we've got in fact, what you see with the graphs that we just saw is that there was a period there of highly unstable climate. And how did the megamammals? I don't necessarily think that they all instantly, but it may have actually been successive stages. To me, that's kind of what it looks like, with maybe the final coup de grace occurring during the Younger Dryas, because to my knowledge, coming out of the Younger Dryas, I think the woolly mammoths and the giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats and the Irish elk and the cave bears and the giant short-faced bear and the castoroides and all the rest were gone, right? So they didn't survive. Now, there's evidence that mammoths did survive, even down to maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, but they survived on islands and they shrank in size, probably because of limitations on their territory and so on, but they're called pygmy mammoths. And so it wasn't a complete extirpation like in one fell swoop, but it was close to it when you look in the geological sense. I'll also mention that interesting Plato, as some of you who've watched my Atlantis presentation know, that Plato named that date for the destruction of Atlantis. He placed that at 9,000 years prior to Solon's journey to Egypt, where he heard the tale. And interestingly, his journey to Egypt took place around 2,600 years ago, about 600 BC. So do the math. comes right out to 11,600. So how interesting. And of course, generally, if it's even noted by historians or archaeologists or whomever, it's just dismissed as a mere coincidence that he places the destruction of Atlantis through an event of subsidence sinks beneath the waves during an exact period of time that we know that sea level was rapidly rising, even to the point where it's been called meltwater pulse 1b. So now here is essentially a graph that shows us the distribution of ice in the northern hemisphere now. And you can see that there's sea ice over Antarctica, and then there's continental ice or land ice over Greenland. And then I'm going to go back to late glacial maximum times, and it looked more like that. So there's a whole lot more ice in the world. And if I go, let's see one more. Yeah, here we can see on this now we're focusing on North America. And on the left, we actually have two great ice sheets in North America. The Laurentide, which is roughly centered over Hudson Bay, and it's about the size of the Antarctica or South Polar ice cap is now. The Cordilleran ice sheet, you can see there's that little division between them that's they're just right, it's pretty much just east of the Rocky Mountains out on the prairies of Alberta. And that was what some paleontologists and anthropologists have referred to as the ice-free corridor, which may have been a migratory route both for animals and early human migration into North America.
Canada, entombed under 1.5 miles of ice, stands as a testament to the power of planetary forces that defy all human control or prediction.
But the point was, that stuck in my craw for years, and after like a decade, in fact, after I'd become a Freemason, I mentioned that one of the brothers that signed my petition was writing a book. Well, his book was on catastrophism. And I was getting really, really interested in that because, again, I had learned about the ice ages, and I God, really? What? There was, the whole of Canada was buried under 1.5 miles of ice? So were New York City, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, they were all buried under ice? Yes, they were buried under ice. And this is not long ago. This is between 10 and 25,000 years ago. So I just, I'm obsessively curious about stuff. So I wanted to know more about that. And that's when I discovered that science had no answer. Like, what caused the end of the Ice Age? Well, there were old assumptions based upon old models, which, based upon the energy requirements available. In order to melt the quantity of ice that was covering North America and Northwestern Europe, it was between 6 and 7 million cubic miles of ice. That's as much ice as now in Greenland and the South Pole together. So take the amount of ice that you've got now, South Pole, Antarctica, and Greenland, double that. Mm-hmm. And now we're back in the Ice Age.
The 300 years of climatic despair, followed by the warming of the 900s, remind us that the planet's pendulum swings violently, reshaping civilizations in its wake.
Anyways, you had like 300 years of really, bad climate. And then that ameliorated in the 900s. The planet warmed up. That was when, the Scandinavians were colonizing Greenland and farming, where it's now permafrost. And you had this long growing season. You had abundant crops. People were well fed. And you see between 950, say, and 1050 to 1100, the population of Europe expanded enormously. People's lifespans expanded. Infant mortality went down. Even the stature of people during that medieval warm period increased by like 4 inches on average. Well, as a result of
stature increased 4 inches.
About that, yeah.
Wow.
Because it took a few generations, but I mean, look at how much the over the last 2 or 3 generations of Japanese have grown. They used to be considered, I don't want to be racist here, but their stature, they were short. Mm-hmm. But now, I don't know what happened with the Japanese, but their average stature has increased considerably. in the last few. Rob could probably find a statistic on that, but my point is this: society got wealthy. And because of that wealth, they were able to undertake this tremendous enterprise of cathedral building. And then in the early 1300s, the climate flipped again and it got cold. And it started the Little Ice Age. And between like 1312, 1314, and 1330, right in there, 1340, you had a whole series of very bad years where you had agricultural failures. This led to people being hungry. It led to famine. Famine caused people to be malnourished. Their immune systems got weakened. And then in the 1340s, you had the bubonic plague.
Today's erratic temperature shifts echo those ancient changes, a harbinger of what lies ahead if we fail to recognize the patterns. History warns. Will we listen?
I don't know of temperature change that extreme, although we're looking at some very extreme. I mean, we're looking at 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, which would be about 18 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Mm-hmm. But that's way beyond anything we've experienced in recent times.
Yeah.
I mean, coming out of the Little Ice Age 150 to 200 years ago, temperature of the planet has warmed about a degree. So we're looking at warming of 20 times that much. And some of the studies based on ice cores, Greenland ice cores, Antarctic ice cores, other kinds of proxy evidence, the time span in which this temperature change occurred has gone from 1,000 years to a century, then from a century to a decade, then from a decade to 5 years, and now the latest, as we get to this ever more refined temporal resolution, like from the studies of ice cores, it's down to 1 to 3 years. So what happened? That's a mystery. Now, what did people do? That's a very interesting question to me. Like, you need to find a place of refuge to ride this thing out. Because at the same time these extreme temperature changes are happening, the whole surface of the planet is being remodeled in a major way.
Randall envisions the necessity of sanctuaries, refuges for the wise and prepared, when the earth once again unleashes its unrelenting fury.
One of the things that would absolutely be necessary is to find the places of refuge. Now, in ecologists, when they look at the decimation of a whole ecosystem, like a great microcosm of that would be the Mount St. Helens eruption of 1980, when you had about 200 square miles just utterly decimated, turned into a lunar landscape. Well, you've got biologists and ecologists and stuff have been studying how nature has reclaimed that. And what usually happens is you have these pockets where some seeds or whatever, spores primarily, because the first colonizer plants that show up in the aftermath of catastrophe are ferns. And so this is what happened. You have these pockets of life recovering, and then from those little islands of life, of biological activity, it spreads out. And at the rate that it's been recovering, it's been 40 years now since that big eruption. And it's probably, there's now forests encroaching upon the area of devastation. Give it another 50 to 100 years and it should be completely recovered. Now, the question is, if we're faced, because to me, two questions. One, the historical question, because we now know that these tremendous catastrophes have happened and have happened repeatedly. So, and then if they happen again, for example, we know that asteroid and cometary impacts are way more frequent than anybody was imagining a generation ago. But interestingly, what we've seen in the last 25, 30 years is that geologists looking at the Earth down below have seen multiple scars from these tremendous cosmic events. Impacts of asteroids and meteors, comets and cometary debris. There's right now about 200 craters and or astroblems that have been discovered. Now, an astrobleme is an impact scar, but it's usually buried beneath the surface. It's called, literally translates as star wound. Star wound.